About 4 years ago, Dan Doctoroff, the time the CEO of Bloomberg and previously the deputy mayor of New York City, responsible for rebuilding Ground Zero after 9/11, received an email from Eric Schmidt, at the time the CEO of Google, titled City of the Future. Over the next few years, Dan would assemble a team of urbanists and technologists with the goal of addressing some of the biggest problems that urban spaces face today. And about 18 months ago, that small startup within Alphabet would actually win an RFP to be able to design the Eastern District of Toronto, the waterfront district of Toronto. My name is Prem Ramaswammi, and I'm head of product of Sidewalk Labs. My team is responsible for the digital hardware and software that will enable us to radically improve the quality of urban life. Now, we know problems exist in cities today. Most of you probably flew in from a city. How many of you flew in from the South Bay? Anyone? A few of you. LA? None? All right. New York? Atlanta? Vancouver? Toronto? Didn't fly in. That was a trick question. But we know that all cities that exist today have these problems that are crushing them, right? We have traffic causing congestion with longer commutes that are preventing us from spending time with the people we love the most. Instead, we're stuck in cars or trains trying to commute to get to and from the places that we're actually trying to get things done in. Our cities produce suffocating pollution, resulting in higher asthma rates for our children and an unforgiving climate. If you think about it, there's a recent study from The Guardian showing that in cities around the world, children have little microparticles in the valves of their hearts. And cities suffer from their own success. As they get better, they become more unaffordable and less diverse. And this crowding out of what makes a city beautiful has become a real problem right in the South Bay as well as here in Toronto. So how do we go about reimagining the city of the future to improve the quality of life? We published what we refer to as our Master Innovation and Development Plan. This was an epic tome to the city of Toronto about a few weeks ago. It's about 1,524 pages long, weighed about 18 pounds, was 4 volumes and about 10 chapters, each going through a level of detail on innovation in an area where we think cities can take a stepwise level of improvement. Now, how we go about doing that in Toronto is ensuring that we combine innovations along with the urban problems that actually exist out there. We want to make Toronto a global hub for the urban innovation, kind of the civ tech as well as the gov tech industries as they burgeon. We want this neighborhood, by the way, built entirely of timber, sustainable wood, in a way that serves as these carbon vaults that capture carbon that's currently causing us to lose the world we love. We want to create a climate positive district, not climate neutral, climate positive district in the local area, an economic engine that creates thousands of jobs, as well as solve some of the biggest transit and commuter problems that exist in the city today. Now, if there are 5 things you take away from 1,524 pages, it's that this document represents the feedback of tens of thousands of Torontonians. And it would produce what we think is the most innovative district in the world, where we hope to place an urban innovation institute. We hope this creates inclusive and sustainable growth. We, for example, promised 40% of below market housing in the area. And we know that we want this to support the public sector, because the role of the public sector is so important in our cities. Finally, the plan would generate an economic windfall, we believe, for Toronto, Ontario, and more broadly for Canada. But at the end of the day, I'm speaking to a tech audience, so I want to talk a little bit about why I think this is exciting for developers out there, for developers in Toronto as well as across the world. So as we think about this team that we've assembled together, we want to go about solving some of these problems in this district of the future. And here's some of the things that we've thought about as quality of life problems that exist today. And I'm going to dive deep into 3 of them specifically, the 3 I mentioned earlier. So let's start with mobility, right? We hope to build a mobility system for this new district that literally reclaims the public realm that we ceded to automobiles about 100 years ago. We created a technology, and then we gave up to that technology and said, you own the roads, we no longer own them as the people of cities. Now, one of the things we know that's happening is autonomous vehicles and public transit are coming about, and those vehicles will yield to pedestrians in ways that will allow us to dynamically use our public realm for many different uses. Now, one thing you'll notice in this picture is there's no curb. There's no delineation of the sidewalk from the road, because we believe in the future you will not need that. The space will be ours as pedestrians, bikers, to walk around freely without worry of the vehicles that take us from A to B. Our goal here, again, is to have 77% of trips in this local district to go via public transit. We want this to be 100% accessible by bicycle. Every single building will be bicycle accessible. How many of you bike today to and from work? We want 0 deaths caused. A vision 0 for the number of traffic fatalities in this new district. And we want it to be a 15-minute city. Everything that you need in life, whether it's a school, a grocery store, a doctor's office, should all be within a 15-minute commute from your location. These things will fundamentally change the way we think about our space, the way we live in that space, and the way we engage in that space. Now, how do we go about doing this from a technology perspective, right? We need to know what's fundamentally happening on the road to be able to manage it properly. One of the technologies you could easily use for something like this is a camera, but we know cameras contain all types of privacy pitfalls. We don't want to be monitoring our public spaces in a way that make us feel like we're living in an authoritarian state. But luckily, privacy is becoming a feature of technology on its own. So what you're seeing here is a picture of a very basic LiDAR camera at an intersection, identifying boxes around cars, trucks, bicycles, so on and so forth. What you notice about this is I can't identify license plates. I cannot identify people. I cannot identify individuals through this. Now, there's a certain amount of technology that gets you so far, and then there are business rules that need to get you further when you think about privacy and technology. This is true that I can't identify individuals, but what if somebody were coming by on a wheelchair? And that population is low enough where they are now identifiable. And so this is where we need to have business rules on top of this and think about privacy in the design of what we implement in a way that allows us to ensure that the data we collect is truly non-personal, and that the de-identified data we collect has business rules around it to ensure against re-identification in a way that we can still achieve our quality of life goals, which is vision 0 around death, a transportation system that works the best, roads that do not sit as massive amounts of space with no cars on them during most of the day. We should be able to use those for purposes that we want to as a society. We also want to build a district that's climate positive by planning things like south-facing buildings to garner the most solar yield, using machine learning and cloud computing to think about all of the different master plans, the billions of opportunities you have out there and how you design your cities, modeling out how shadows fall, how light travels. And we want these buildings to be built out of tall timber. Tall timber is a material that can create a sustainable wood ecosystem right here in Canada, create thousands of new carpentry jobs, allow us to essentially create these carbon vaults that are not only beautiful and biophilic for individuals living in them, giving them that feeling of nature while they're in a city, but also functioning as a way to allow our globe to continue existing. We also want to work on things like thermal grids, district scale energy management systems, and the control systems around this all give an opportunity for technology to play a role. At the end of the day, if we can prove climate positive cities are profitable, we essentially have a chance, an end run around climate change. So this is an example of what we call the generative design project. So in this project, we are taking billions of different plans where we change things like the building envelope sizes, the road sizes, the different street widths, and then we rotate the whole thing 360 degrees on an axis. And what you find is for the existing master plan, for example, for Villiers Island in the Portlands, we can actually squeeze out a lot more ground floor area and still get open space and daylight access. This is an access that normally people don't think about. If you increase the amount of retail space or the amount of residential space, usually you lose daylight access. Usually you lose parks. But if we actually look at the full space of solutions using what technology can provide us, the question is, can we find a more optimal solution? Again, our goal here is to reach this concept of climate positivity, because if we can prove climate positivity is profitable, any taxpayer dollar in the future not spent towards climate change is wasted. And this will allow us essentially to prove that being climate positive will also be profitable in a business model and capitalist sense. What we've shown here is the math behind how Quayside alone, the first 12 acres, can get to 89% of our climate goals. As we move forward throughout what we've proposed as an idea district throughout the Portlands, we believe we can attain that climate positivity as things like thermal loops are used for a broader population across a broader geography. And finally, we also want to ensure the city of the future is affordable and diverse. Let me be clear, we don't want to build Elysium. We want a district with a vast array of job types. We talked about a tall timber industry creating all types of carpentry jobs. We want people to be able to afford to live in the houses and the skyscrapers that they build. We want to ensure that different backgrounds and different income levels are able to live here. And why? Because cities are this beacon of diversity. They bring people from all over the world, speaking different languages with different skill sets, shove them in a small space together. And we know how that works in offices. You know, Jonathan Rosenberg at Google often used to say, if you have space for 150 people and you hired 150 people, take space for 50 of them and turn it into a game room and shove the other 150 into a smaller space, because it forces these collisions that allow innovation, that allow new thoughts to spring forth. It's why cities today are where 2/3 of the world's population will live by the year 2050. That's another 2.5 billion people moving into cities. And it's interesting, we're having this talk in Toronto, a city where 51% of the residents of this city were not born in Canada. It's a fascinating place that we can try to push forward this concept of a diverse and affordable city where 40% of the housing units will be below market rate. And we think this is achievable because not only does tall timber provide all of these positives from a climate perspective, it's also much cheaper than steel or concrete or the other materials used today in construction. And so we really do have an opportunity here to make a radical change in the way we think about urban spaces. So my team's mission is to radically improve the quality of urban life by using digital technology. I thought I'd walk through a little what this actually means. You know, we're not interested in the incremental improvements. Those will likely happen without Sidewalk Labs. What we're interested in thinking about is what are the step change improvements that nobody else can do without the patient capital that we fundamentally have. We want things to improve. It's a self-explanatory one. The quality of urban life, that's the key. This is about people. Cities are fundamentally about the people and the residents in the city, and we want to create a city that allows people to truly thrive. People should not feel that they have to suffer the indignities of living in a city. We want to use digital technology, but to be clear, when we say use it, I didn't use the word build here for a reason, because a large portion of the city will be procured. And we as Sidewalk Labs will never have the creativity to come up with all the solutions that exist out there. I'll get to this a little later, but we're looking to build a platform more akin to the web than to the iPhone. We want a set of open standards where third parties can come in and find a solution that we never thought of ourselves, can create one that works for residents, that works for individuals, that works for businesses, that works for government. And then finally, the digital technology, which means both hardware and software. Mind you, there are other technologies we're working on, like the tall timber I mentioned before, but my team doesn't get to play with wood, unfortunately. And as I said, it's hardware and software, right? It's the physical realm of a place. And I'll get to this point also and why I think this is so important for the city of Toronto. I wanted to start by talking a bit about empathy. As a product manager, when I ask people, what is the most important skill that you think a product manager must have? I think the answer is empathy. You have to be able to understand and share the feelings and experiences of another if you want to build something that someone will actually use. How many of you developers out there consider yourselves part-time PMs for the work you do? And how many of you agree with this, that empathy is probably the most important skill that you can have? And it's a hard skill to gain. It's something you gain only by getting out there, by talking to individuals, by pressing the flesh, pounding the pavement. And Sidewalk Labs has done this over the last year and a half. We've engaged with over 21,000 people. We've run hackathons and community events. We've sponsored fellows. We have spent hours talking to the community. We've done stakeholder meetings, engagements. We have learned. We've started an office in Toronto that contains over 1/3 of our staff. And we've really imbued this city into our veins. Now, Sidewalk Labs' product process is a little different than a typical technology company. We're working in a very different space, highly regulated as a city, much slower timescales, 5 to 20 years to build out a city, not 5 to 20 weeks. So when we think about this, we also bring together these two distinct groups, these urbanists who don't speak a technology language and these technologists who don't understand why it has to take so damn long, right? And so what product and design do here is not only do we get to share in the expertise on how urban space is built and learn from these subject matter experts get to learn from products and designers on the different methods we use, like design sprints, to validate things more quickly. How rapid prototyping could work in an urban space. How the RFP processes could change in a city to be better suited so that startups out there don't feel that working for government is an albatross around them. When you think about product development, you think about this double diamond method, right? There's a discovery stage. The funnel opens up, you brainstorm, you get more ideas, then you winnow it down, and then you start planning out an MVP, you get a bunch of features, and then you winnow that down to shipping, right? So a discovery and then a delivery phase. And that's how I think of this actually more simply as why, what, and how. Why are we doing this? What are we doing? How are we going to go about delivering it? And this is fundamentally a concept that we're bringing into the urban space, a new concept that we all are very familiar with, that we've worked with on a day-to-day basis. And yet there's parts that we learn along the way too. So we work closely with a government agency called Waterfront Toronto that's done a ton of research in this space. That helps us answer the whys fundamentally. Our user experience research that occurs from a normal technical perspective is also mixed with a bunch of public charrettes and public stakeholder engagement forums that teach us all types of new things that we would not have learned in the typical styles that we use as technologists. But we also need to consider privacy much earlier in the process than the average tech startup does. Privacy is often the thing you think about a few weeks before launch. For us, it's the thing you think about in the why phase itself, because we're dealing in the public realm. We have this process called a responsible data use assessment that we go about putting together in the very early stages of a product that make us think about all the future negative consequences of the data we're collecting, as well as do we even need the data? Smart cities, for example, is one of the monikers I personally dislike. I don't think there are dumb cities out there, to be clear. And I think the term smart city has been weaponized to mean that you just use technology to solve the problem. But if you start with why, fundamentally what's the quality of life goal, and then you work on what, you may not need technology. And that's part of our process that we go down in every one of these. So Sidewalk Labs right now as a company is somewhere in this stage, right? We're in the early MVP of a few ideas. We don't have anything actually out there in the ground in Toronto yet. We're in the process of gaining approval and support and social license. And we've heard some big themes as we go about gaining that social license. So This is more broadly across Sidewalk Labs, that it's important to focus on the critical impacts. This is where things like mobility, sustainability, buildings, these come out of those fundamental needs that exist today. To be inclusive and to make room for others. We had an entire charrette around accessibility, both in the digital and the public realms. The third one we'll talk about next a little more, but no tech for tech's sake. Make sure the public sector has a strong role. Prove yourself and the concept. Build on what has been done and present a transparent business model. I think we fear the concept of business models in this space, but business models allow for replicability. They allow for scale. What we heard from a technology and digital government specific perspective, and I start with the first one, which was no tech for tech's sake. We're not looking to apply AI in a space where AI hasn't been applied before. What we're looking to do is find a space where there's a fundamental quality of life goal. If AI or ML happen to be a thing that will help us increase that, so be it. But we're not hammers looking for those nails right now. No vendor lock-in. I'll talk about this with a specific example, but as I said, we want to create the web as a platform for these cities. Think about how wonderful the web is. Think about all of the things that have come about because a bunch of professors got together and created TCP/IP, HTML, a few other open standards, and suddenly, boom. You have $1 trillion of innovation occurring on top of that. All of you are here because a bunch of individuals created a very open platform. And I'm a fundamental believer that open beats closed every day of the week. We want to catalyze growth for local Canadian companies. We want to make sure no data for data's sake, just as we said no tech for tech's sake. What does this mean? When we say no data for data's sake, we're not going to collect it and figure out how to use it later. We're only going to collect it if it's going to be used for the improvement of a quality of life goal. And part of that is thinking about privacy by design, considering privacy in the early parts. A large part of this comes from GDPR standards and other global standards that are starting to get implemented. And yourselves, as you think about the work you do, this is going to affect you sooner than later in a good way. You should start thinking about how the privacy by design processes and what you build get started much earlier. Data should definitely serve the public good. And finally, we need to establish ethical data governance for the long term. This means, we have proposed a data trust that I'll talk about in a bit that would be responsible for regulating the use of data in this space in the physical realm. So as I said, we've responded to these concerns. We believe in gathering and using the data responsibly. We've talked a bit about privacy by design. Talked a little about the concepts of no vendor lock-in. I'll go through a specific example of this, but if your cities are built in a truly modular sense where each component communicates via a RESTful API in a published standard, and each of those modular components is small enough, then no longer are you signing the $150 million contract with vendor one. You're signing a bunch of $1 million contracts or $100,000 contracts, and you can swap out parts much more quickly. And we'll talk about what that fundamentally does for a city, for its innovation cycle, and examples where that falls apart today. And then finally, we want to push the envelope. We do want to still be able to radically improve that quality of life. So I wanted to talk a bit about open systems. Let's talk about the web for a second again, right? This is sort of the beauty of the web we have today. We can use a multitude of web browsers, go to an array of web pages, all served by an array of servers. And the average user has no idea that this complexity is all underlined by a few open standards. Right? It wasn't that hard to create the web. At the end of the day, you had standards for formatting like HTML and CSS. You had formats for images like PNGs and JPEGs. You had interactivity in JavaScript, communication via HTTP. You had security via things like SSL. These were layers that we all agreed to in open standards. They first were implemented, published, people got together. This is a democratic process that brought about the web. Now the question is, why can't we do something like this for our cities? All we're talking about here is well-documented, standardized formats and interfaces. Why are cities procured in a way where you cannot figure out what the format was used to output data from the red light camera hanging at the intersection? Why can't you go to a public data repository and get useful data in a standard format, but instead get a ton of PDFs that you then have to write a massive amount of ETL around to do anything with? And why isn't that data more portable from city to city? Why haven't more cities adopted common standards around this? Why are we reinventing the wheel with every single city in the world when many of them suffer from similar problems? Do these problems sound familiar to you? Because if they do, they sound like probably many of the solutions you folks implement where you look for that scale, right? Where you see problems and inefficiencies of systems where if you build something that scales out, you can actually provide a solution for individuals. Now, all of this is underlined by this idea of responsible data use. So one of the big things we've proposed is a regulatory body called an urban data trust. Because at the end of the day, you can have as much technology to implement privacy, but you still need business rules and regulation to ensure both contractually as well as from a regulatory perspective, good behavior is being enforced. So we've suggested an independent urban data trust. We've also suggested things like that public realm data should be de-identified at first use by default. That people should have an understanding of how their data is used in English, not through a 30-page EULA that they hit next on. Part of that is publishing responsible data use assessments. These are documents that actually show our thought process in creating the product in a way that was privacy safe. We also want to use responsible data use guidelines around this for both AI as well as more generally for the use of that data. Because fundamentally, you don't get access to the data until you say what you're going to use it for. And I think this is a key component. We don't believe the Urban Data Trust should allow fishing expeditions on data streams. Finally, a large part of this can be girded by published standards. If our RFP processes forced our cities to only acquire items that used open standards, we wouldn't have building management systems that didn't talk to the next door neighbor so that their HVACs don't turn on at the same time and cause a coal-fired power plant to turn on next door. But the reason they do today is because no one fundamentally is incentivized to do the work to make it open, and they believe by keeping it closed they have a competitive advantage. So I want to use an example which I think illustrates how Quayside and the district we wish to build will be slightly different. So we talked about the autonomous vehicle example earlier with public transit. We talked about the idea that you need to know what's happening on the road to be able to build such a district. Now, if you need to know what's going on in the road, you need some LiDAR hanging somewhere. Now, today, if you wanted to hang up a sensor somewhere in the city, you would need to get a bucket truck. There's an unclear regulatory and permitting process that is different based on your connections or based on your knowledge of how the city works and the administration that happens to exist at the time. And in addition to that, it'll cost you between $5,000 and $20,000. And that's just direct cost to you to put up one sensor. That does not include the costs of traffic that you cause, the congestion, all of that, the downstream costs that are caused, not to mention the safety of the individual who's up on that bucket truck. What's funnier is once you cut into that light pole, you will notice that there are a set of wires that are perfectly labeled. They're not. And so even pulling power or connectivity at a lamppost is such a difficult concept, which is why cities today, when you put a red light camera up, you want that red light camera to last for at least 10 years, which means it better have lasted for at least 5 years before then, right? And so that means by the time you get your camera up there, you're at least one generation behind the technology curve. And by the time you take it down, you're about 4. So how do we go about solving this problem? So we have designed a piece of infrastructure we call Koala. We call them koala mounts because they're cute and one hugs the other. But the idea is that for our koala mounts, can we create the urban USB port? How many of you are old as me and remember the ages before USB? Where you had serial buses and you had to install individual drivers and nothing would plug and play, and it was a terrible, horrible world. Then a group of people at Intel got together and they said, this is dumb. Should be one standard. And they got Microsoft and they said, hey, can you create a bunch of computer mouses, that all function off this standard? And can you make your joysticks and every device you create all function off this standard? And that was all it took. It took one agreement between Intel and Microsoft to say, and we'll make it open. That way third parties can do it too, and you're going to make it plug and play on the operating system side. That makes it so easy that it reduces the cost of creating new devices. You don't have to have a whole team creating drivers now, right? Think about the explosion of devices that have happened since. And think about how USB itself has continued to improve. We had USB-A, then B, then C, and micro USB. I can name a bunch of them along the way. I have a closet of old wires at home. But those standards improve along the way. And now USB-C can literally power my TV. It's a crazy concept, right? A simple open standard that fundamentally reduced costs for everyone, created an explosion of innovation on devices I would have never thought of. Like I had at one point a USB Nerf gun launcher attached to my laptop that I could code to launch when it saw people walking by. I bet you the founders of USB never thought about that solution. So we want to create Koala to be the USB port for a city, to give you high power, over 800 watts, high bandwidth connectivity, we're talking over a gigabit per second, all in a hermetically sealed environment where it's a contact plate that allows this to happen over millimeter radio, and power occurs essentially inductively, but at a very close range. That now you don't need a bucket truck for, that someone can literally use a reacher grabber to drop the item on using the power of gravity. Or a drone can drop in place maybe in the future. Now, what does this do fundamentally? If you're the city procurer now, do you need the $5,000 camera for the intersection? Or do you buy the $100 one that's closer to the technology curve, but it doesn't matter if it's out of date in 2 years because you'll buy a new $100 one in 2 years? When you're deploying 5G and you need antennas of high density all over the city and suddenly there's a concert in an open park, does that mean you always need 100 5G antennas in that park, or do you just redeploy them to the park for the time you need them, then redeploy them to the next facility when you need them? It changes the order and the sense of procurement. It brings the concepts of rapid iteration and prototyping into the cityscape in a way it hasn't been done before. And this is fundamentally what I am most excited about. Because if we can get this room of people to start working on some of the fundamental problems that we have in urban spaces, that I said 2/3 of the world's population is going to be experiencing by the year 2050, I think we have a chance of making cities wonderful, making the climate positive, and fundamentally making the air breathable and the water potable for the next 2 generations. So I'll end and I'll open up for questions. I want to make sure I leave enough time for that. So we have about 30 minutes or so for questions. But I want to end with kind of our vision of what we think the eastern waterfront of Toronto could look like in about 20 years. Now, this is an artist's rendering, but at the end of the day, I want you to notice how green it is. I want you to notice those tall timber buildings in the background giving you a feeling of nature again. And as I walk through cities, whether it's New York or Toronto, the greatness of these cities are fundamentally in its people, in its inhabitants, in the residents who are there to essentially ensure these cities are vibrant, diverse, democratic. If we can reimagine the digital platforms that cities are built on and ensure they are open, I'm excited about the untapped creativity that will be created, not just for Toronto and Ontario and Canada, but hopefully for the world. Thank you very much.
So we got a lot of questions about tall timber.
Oh, really? Cool. Okay.
So I kind of highlighted those ones. I think we can start with here. How can they help?
How can you help us now? That's a great question. So we are early in our process. There's a newsletter we put out, the Sidewalk newsletter. How many of you are from the local area, Toronto? How many of you knew about Sidewalk Labs before today? All right. So for those of you from the local area, we are presenting regularly at public forums. We would love for your presence, for your questions, for your concerns, for your support, wherever you might be. For example, on Monday, I'll be back in Toronto speaking at the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel from 1 to 5 p.m. at Waterfront Toronto. This is a public forum open to the public. This is your city, your land. You should come. You should hear this. We'll be diving deep on the business model of Sidewalk Labs. It's an opportunity to learn more about us. Now, secondly, I said sign up to the newsletter because we're early, but we will start publishing more open standards. We've published one, for example, a tool called Common Space that allows parks to understand their usage better in a way that hopefully allows them to gain the funding or make the changes they need in the programming space to make it more useful for the community around them. We worked with an open standard that the Gale Institute published, created an app to help what was done with paper and pencil in a much more scalable, in a much more data quick way that allows people to get that feedback loop much better. Now that was an open source tool. We published it out there. Hasn't been taken up by a community. There are opportunities for communities to get together, to find cities that are interested in this. We have about 10 cities awaiting for us to do something with this, and we're pushed it out there saying there's supposed to be a vibrant developer community here. Now I get it. CivTech and GovTech are scary areas to get into. They're regulated. But I'm telling you that we're at the cusp of changing some of this, and I'm very excited for that future world, and I want you folks along with us on that journey. What's the next one?
Tell us more about tall timber. They want to know what kind of chemicals are used, how tall can it go, why it hasn't been used with other projects, or has it being used currently that we don't know about?
So there are 14 tall timber skyscrapers around the world today, 14 of them. I think the tallest height that they've been able to reach is approximately 20 stories. A large reason for that is because steel and concrete, when steel was created, for those of you who don't know the history of it, everything was timber. And then steel was created, and steel allowed us to break past 10 stories. Right? Steel is essentially what allowed the modern city to be born. But what we know about steel is a terrible supply chain process. The making of steel, the smelting of metal, the shipping of steel in large containers, the fact that anyone seen a building go up ever locally? What do you notice in front of it? Huge amounts of road just blocked off, right? With huge trucks, with rebar, with all of this material just hanging around there. This is a nasty supply chain that we've created for ourselves. Now, tall timber on the flip side is essentially compressed laminate timber. What you can think about here is we make trees become an agricultural positive. Rather than being raised to build something that's more expensive and useful. And when those trees die normally in a forest, they decompose, they let out methane, but instead what we do is we harvest the trees, turn them into high pressurized board of timber. We modularly construct these buildings, and we found a way to get up to 35 stories at this point, and we'll be working with the City of Toronto to make Canada the first place where tall timber skyscrapers are essentially the norm. Now, it's funny also about timber. One of the common questions we get is, what about the fire risk? Now, when my friends ask me that, I'm like, oh my God, we didn't think about, no, I'm kidding. We did think about that. And so when you think about tall timber, this tall timber is pressurized into compressed laminate timber, which means it's actually not anymore, it's not flammable at all at this point. And what we found, interestingly, is this tall timber structure actually still has some steel joints where the timber pieces come together and a steel base underneath it. But what we found is the steel base and the steel sockets have to be covered fully in timber, because what does steel do in heat? Melts, expands, it changes your structural integrity. What does wood do if it doesn't melt in heat? It doesn't actually retain that heat, it doesn't change form, which means you're actually much safer with the wood over time. And so we found that the wood is actually much more fire retardant, not to mention the fact that there have been numerous psychological studies that show the value of having exposed wood, and I talked about biophilic nature of the design, but the ability to reconnect with nature in our cities itself. I hope that answered some of the questions about tall timber. Oh, one final thing. This will create about 3,000 carpentry union jobs locally, a factory that would create a supply chain of tall timber here in Canada, where there are many forests that exist today that are getting cut down for different reasons that we don't want to see cut down. And these buildings, as I said, also serve as these carbon vaults because they're about 75% recyclable after 100 years.
So the next question is about, I think you talked about business rules early on. And then since we're focusing on a public space, public data, where's the line with business rules becoming laws?
So I use the term business rules largely because of my past. I think this is a great question. I use the term business rules to mean the difference between code that you write and the ability to understand that code via written, contractual, whatever you want to call it, some rule that you write down that you understand. The difference here is, I'll bring out an example here that Google suffered from in their AI bias algorithms, where when they initially ran recognition of items in Google Photos, there was a terrible, terrible instance where people who were black were being shown as a gorilla in Google Photos. This was terrible, right? Because a product manager didn't think ahead about the business rules that need to be written, the if case. Just do not let the following things happen, right? There are many cases like this where AI bias is introduced in a way because you don't think about the bias of the underlying data set. Now, to the question about, I called it the term business rules, but we think the data trust is a regulatory body. Now, initially, it's an independent body, quasi-government likely, with a few members of government, but it has to have technologists on it. It has to have academics on it. It has to have people who fundamentally understand how to regulate the field they're regulating. And at the end of the day, we're not writing laws as Sidewalk Labs, but we hope the city of Toronto is a sign of how technology should move forward in the public realm. And we think there's a great opportunity for Canada here to show the way for the rest of the world on how to regulate this space properly. Did that help answer the question to the person who asked it?
It was my question, yes, it did.
Perfect.
Okay, so the next one is, so we're talking about responsible data assessment and guidelines. What kind of data will be available or open sourced? So for example,
We have stated that for us as Sidewalk Labs and what we believe the Urban Data Trust, again, we've set forward a recommendation, but this will be a public process that determines the composition as well as what the Urban Data Trust does. But what we have suggested is that all data collected in the public realm be treated as a public asset by default. That means no silos of data. Now, not only must it be treated like a public asset, that the Urban Data Trust requires that it be published in an open format. So no more ETLs either. And this allows you essentially to get that ecosystem of innovation on top of this. And that fundamentally is our hope. Now, mind you, there are pieces of data that will not be fully non-personal. Some pieces of data will be de-identified, and some pieces of data might need to be identified. And in that case, the Urban Data Trust will need contractual rules around who has access to that for what purposes. And they'll have to publish that in a transparent way so the residents can understand also how that's being used.
next one is related to rent over time. Don't we limit the type of jobs available within that 15 minutes? And what's that gonna look like? Is there a process around it?
This is a great question. A large part of this is what is the program mix of a local area, right? So right now, most of our cities do a great job concentrating wealth and then concentrating blight. And what we found is samples of cities that have functioned really well and avoided this problem are cities that found the good right mix of housing and residents. But unfortunately, that also means someone takes a hit on their commute, and we don't think that needs to be the case. What we have on the eastern waterfront is a unique opportunity with almost 800 acres of land to create jobs of all types, industries of all types. There's already a thriving film industry on the waterfront. There used to be factories all over. We've talked about a tall timber factory that we need to create. Modular housing needs to be put together somewhere in a factory structure also. So there are opportunities to create these jobs, and now there's a fundamental question about economic theory, which is you make the place so awesome, price is gonna go up, right? Now part of that is the 40% below market housing, which we have promised as something that will be subsidized, partially subsidized because the city of Toronto believes in that equity, partially subsidized by the businesses that we push out that refund Toronto. So there's some interesting new, first of its kind sort of methods we've suggested in the Master Innovation and Development Plan that say that some of the technologies that we use Quayside as a test bed for, that Toronto will essentially get a recurring royalty for moving forward for X years. This is a way to make cities actually become an innovation playground and to incentivize both parties properly to do the right things.
Okay, so the next one is how do you make things secure, like the koala secure, if you don't identify the people who are in the system?
Great question. So the koalas actually, I think, are super secure. And I think they're super secure because they're regulated by an urban data trust. Because of the fact that you will have some sort of security around who actually gets the power and data, some sort of handshake that happens before you connect. You can actually ensure that the person connecting to the device has been approved by an urban data trust, has an RDUA published, the public has had a chance to comment on that. All of that will happen in advance of this is our hope. Now, in addition to that, there's also some interesting audit methods that you have if you have centralized understanding of what's going on the devices that are physically connected. How many of you have Nest Cams at home or Google Home devices or Alexa or some IoT device or other? This is a fun crowd to talk to, let me tell you. Often the hands do not go up when I say this stuff at other forums. How many of you have had one of those devices have a security vulnerability recently and been like, shit, I gotta unplug everyone in my house and find where the wire goes, right? It's a pain today to manage these sorts of things. You don't know when your devices are going rogue. You have no understanding of that. What we believe that Koala provides is if you state, for example, that you're collecting LiDAR imagery like we showed earlier, it should be 1/10 of the data than if you were collecting a live video feed, and that should be auditable. This creates a level of transparency and control. If your device goes rogue and starts performing a massive DDoS attack, you should be able to just pull them offline pretty quickly, depower them, break the connectivity to them, right? This creates that level of control that's actually, I think, something that the web lacks a little bit today. And so we've talked to folks like Vince Cerf, one of the early founders of the internet, about how he would redesign it today knowing what has come about over the last 30 years and taken some of those into account. We're working with local companies, even BlackBerry, to understand some of their security standards around this.
So I guess you kind of answered the question. Whoever asked about how to collect more sensitive data, how do you maintain it, that goes along the same the answer you gave. The other thing is you talked about empathy, and then you're dealing with governments, you're dealing with the public. Talk a little bit about it. What did you learn? What can they take away from that?
You know, I read a op-ed recently that was critical of our project. And one of the lines in the op-ed was suggesting that government can never be smart enough to regulate technology. And I just fundamentally think that's sad and wrong. I want my government to be smart enough to understand technology and regulate it, just like they're smart enough to give us safe streets when we walk outside. Just like they're smart enough to figure out how traffic works, which is actually a very complex problem, to be clear. Like figuring out timing of lights is like a massively complex problem. Most cities get it right. They have all types of traffic engineers. They have all types of extremely bright, talented, and passionate individuals who believe in the role of government to help our lives get better. So when I think about the empathy that I've gained for government, I think it's that empathy to understand that though government moves slowly, it moves slowly by design. That's a feature, not a bug. And the question is, how do you go about working inside that system to talking to the person on the other side of the table? So when we talk about Koala and we talk through this process of how that changes your RFP, how that changes your procurement, how that changes the cycle of innovation you're able to work inside, it excites people in government. There's a reason Waterfront Toronto has been such a great partner for us. They've been tasked with figuring out how to build an innovative district for Toronto. Been an excellent partner for us because they've been able to think forward. So I think we, as technologists, have sort of siloed and gilded ourselves and moved ourselves away from governance. I like to joke, I think of myself at some point in the future maybe having a life in government in some way, shape, or form. And my parents are like, "What? You want to be a leper?" My response to them is like, if you don't treat it, it spreads. If only bad people take part in a political process, then yes, the political process is broken. If you don't have technologists taking part in the political process, yes, you have senators and congressmen talking about the tubes and not really understanding how the internet works, right? So if you want your members of parliament, if you want your mayors, if you want your city councils to be smarter and better, take part. That's what I've learned through this process in terms of empathy.
Awesome. So I'm working with students. I'm trying to get them into technology. and we send these experts to become speakers. How is education and Sidewalk Labs and the model that you guys are building? How is that going? How do you see that evolving into? What is changing there?
There's some places, I should start by saying there's some places where we believe fundamentally government has a role, right? Like education is one of them. Like we are not as Sidewalk Labs going to start running public schools in Quayside, absolutely not, right? Like Canada has a wonderful national healthcare system. We do not plan on supplanting that in any way, shape, or form. These are things that work today. That said, one thing we think this gives an interesting opportunity for is, how many of you raised your hand and said you're from the local area, from Toronto? How many of you have like a large number of tech friends? What percentage, if you could just call out of them, are still in Canada? Half?
We got 20% over there.
20? Yeah, right? Like, look, like one of my strongest PMs on my team is a Torontonian who sits in New York next to me, right? Like this is a problem that cities face today. They run to Silicon Valley or to centers or hubs that excellence is created. One of the things we want to do is we think that Quayside, if we build it properly with these open standards and we create an Urban Innovation Institute, we were suggesting funding a $20 million VC fund focused on urban innovation and CivTech and GovTech as kind of a primer for the space. These startups are geographically tied. They're tied to Toronto. This is where they will come to MVP at the least, right? This is where their headquarters will initially be placed. That creates a huge opportunity for the area. And so we do think there is an opportunity here. There's a new burgeoning field that mashes up urbanism, technology, GovTech, CivTech, kind of all of these spaces. And if you think to where we were about 7 years ago with MedTech, and it's funny because my previous product at Google before I came to Sidewalk Labs was on health search. You know, doctors will tell you to Google if you want to die, right? Like, you know, Google search will lead you to your death, right? Is the term that doctors use. And there's this break also in that field about 7 years ago, but now today it's very different. Every doctor you go to has an iPhone and is using it for some reason, is typing in an electronic medical record, has started understanding that technology is part of their workflow and helpful and assistive to them. I think we're in the same spot with the government tech and CivTech space, and I hope the Urban Innovation Institute, the VC fund, the open standards can help kind of throw lighter fluid on that ecosystem to really grow. Probably shouldn't have used lighter fluid when I talked about tall timber earlier, so scratch that from your memory.
Okay, next question is two questions, more technical. How about 3D printing buildings, and what about using solar panels to do wireless charging?
So let's talk about the second one first, which is solar panels. I love talking about solar panels because there are all types of cool things you can do with solar panels and batteries, and the technology here is getting so much better, right? You know, we're talking about batteries soon that are like these salt ponds that capture carbon. So like batteries will soon be free because they capture carbon from the environment. That's just a whole massively fascinating concept, right? If you think about solar panels and how efficient they're starting to get, where you're getting smart solar panels that move with the sun, and you're getting solar panels that are being built into the sides of buildings, like right into the non-window sides of buildings that collect solar energy. And you're getting batteries that are built as these gel packs into the beams of buildings themselves as a way to collect that power. You're getting to a point where each building is essentially self-sustaining and resilient on its own. That's a pretty cool point to get to, but there's some amount of planning that goes into this too. You know, right now today, the way master planning is done is someone just tries to get a street grid and some building envelopes to get past a bunch of city approvals, because once they do that, that's your plan for 50 years, don't touch it. And then they throw it over the fence to someone who goes builds the buildings, and they throw it over the fence to someone who goes lives in the buildings. And what does that mean? The person who designed the street grid does not reap the benefits of if they planned the street grid south-facing for the building so that they collected the maximum amount of solar light. The person who built the building doesn't really care, as long as it got the passive house certification or whatever they need, they don't care how it actually, from an outcome perspective, behaves afterwards, because you're the one paying the heating bill, not them. So we're trying to solve what we think is currently a global minima that we've reached, rather than the global maxima that we can. So that's kind of does that answer the solar panel question? I think it did, right?
I think so.
All right, and then the final question was?
The final question was, I 3D printing.
Oh, 3D printing. Oh, I love talking about 3D printing. 3D printers aren't that big yet. That's the short answer.
3D printing buildings. So
Yeah, 3D printing buildings. They're just not that big yet. So like we've looked at robotic building in different ways. Katera is doing some cool things in this space with 3D printing, but they just don't work on the scale of tall structures yet. Will they get there? Probably. That said, 3D printing buildings, there's a question for me on how sustainable that process will be over time versus actually thinking about wood. You know, Quayside as an example is not actually going to be, it's going to create a little bit below market return rates for us as Sidewalk Labs. And we're okay with that for two reasons. One is we think a lot of the technologies we create will be exportable, will be things we can do in other places around the world, and will be, you know, purchased at market rates, so that's okay. But the other part of it is because we want to prove that this is the right thing to do. Or like part of this company fundamentally believes we want to build a climate positive district that has zero deaths for mobility, that reclaims the public realm for the people, that's affordable, that's diverse, that's like a beacon for cities around the world. We're creating essentially the city that is the city of the future, right? And we want people to come here and learn from that. And we want them to replicate it globally. I like to joke that in 20 years, if we're out of business because we have 100 competitors, we would have succeeded. So that's where I hope the ecosystem is moving towards. Only time will tell if we're right or not.
So some of them already want to move in. What that process is going to look like.
Yeah, you know, I've been joking with our CEO, Dan Doctoroff, that we should run a Tesla-like program and start taking like the deposits in, but no one else is for it yet. All right, I think that's all the time for questions, right? Thank you very much for your time. I'll be around for a bit longer in the back. Please feel free to come by and talk to me. For those of you locally in Toronto, again, I ask, beg, plea for you to come to our public forums, to things like the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel, to sign up for our newsletter, to learn more, and to help get this plan approved. Thank you very much.
And you have an open house on Sundays.
We do have an open house every Sunday at 307 Lakeshore Boulevard, which is right near the edge of the Quayside land that we hope to eventually build this beautiful city of the future on.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.